You said that the Commonwealth will crumble if Keir Starmer doesn't start talking about reparations. What did you mean by that?
Well, the Commonwealth as an institution already has its problems. We have, a dysfunctional family, if you want to call it that. Its roots were in enslavement and colonialism. The sun never set on the British Empire. This country once ruled over all of those other countries, pretty much all of them. And they've decided to come together as a group with that shared history. The problem is we've never really addressed, I'm going to call it the elephant in the room, the bad things that were done. We've heard about deep sorrow and regret. To me, those aren't really fitting sentiments for one of the worst crimes in human history. And now you have CARICOM, the group of Caribbean nations, you have the African Union, you have many others calling for reparations from countries like our own. And we keep saying that we're not only not willing to discuss it, but we're not even willing to offer an apology. And an apology is free.
Do you think the apology would be a sort of watershed moment? Do you think that then the dam would be open and then the scale of reparations would be, possibly out of control?
I mean, it definitely does open the door, to apologise, to say sorry, opens the door for legal liability. It's that language that makes it very, very clear. But the fact that we're unwilling to even talk about it speaks to disrespect. And I think this is what the issue is. This is why it seems as if the Commonwealth will crumble. We've already got nations removing our monarch as their head of state, and we've got countries like India and South Africa, two of the fastest growing economies in the world, deciding to go to the BRICS meeting instead of the Chogam meeting. And it makes for a really, really rocky foundation if we're going to move forward. And the reason why the Commonwealth is important to us, put aside the moral arguments. To me, the moral arguments are important. But let's think about the economic ones. We have recently left our largest trading partner, Europe. We're trying to go around the world, global Britain, looking for friends, and we've forgotten that a lot of the world has a lot of animosity towards us for some very, very good reasons. And many of these countries are now, growing their economies, being quite successful actually, not because of anything we've done to help them, but in spite of us. And I think it would be a part of soft diplomacy to actually say that we're going to look at them as equals, to apologise, because we would apologise to our equals, wouldn't we? Because we see them, we would see them with that respect, and we'd see that we'd have to acknowledge what we had done to them. You don't apologise to people who are beneath you, and that's what it continues to look like, and that's why we may find countries move away.
That's really interesting. Do you think that Keir Starmer believes those countries are beneath the United Kingdom?
I don't think he necessarily does believe that, but I think what happens is when people start talking about reparations in terms of numbers, it goes to that whole anti-wokery argument, and people get really nervous. And obviously, when people start talking about things like money, we've got a budget coming up. So obviously, if anybody was to say anything about reparations at this point in time, people would start making... They would just make mincemeat of it. But this is the problem with all of the arguments that people try and put forward against what they would call wokery, which is usually just about equality. We need to be able to be confident in the arguments that we're making. And I think we can be very, very confident in the fact that we have done something wrong and we have to atone for it. Now, when it comes to the money, there's never going to be an amount of money that could truly atone for the horrors and the atrocities that we committed as an enslaving nation and as a colonizing nation. Let's just be frank, that's it. There's never going to be enough money. But obviously, when people are attempting to make a legal claim, they quantify things. We should actually start by looking at all of the things we can do that don't necessarily cost money. An apology, that's absolutely free. Returning human remains. We have the human remains of some freedom fighters and actually just, former monarchs or chiefs or, people from different parts of the Commonwealth in the British Museum, in other museums. Earlier this year, I had to intervene to stop some skulls from Africa being sold on an auction house's website. that is disgusting. And not only is it disgusting, it contravenes our law. The 2008 Human Tissues Act says that where we do know where these bones come from, we should be returning them. And in some instances, we know exactly who they are. We know who their family members are, and their family members have asked for them back.
Sorry, I'm just quite astounded by that. Why was that even available for sale?
I've got absolutely no idea. I have no idea. And they quickly took it off because it caused so much outrage. There is a clause, however, in the Human Tissues Act, and I think that's because probably the British Museum wanted to keep the so-called Egyptian mummies, that if the remains are over a certain number of years old, you know, there's no ownership of them. But if you know where they come from, you should probably take them back. And artefacts, there are so many things. Like, people call the British Museum the largest collection of stolen goods. At any one time, 99% of what they own is in the basement. And they don't even know everything they have, to the extent that last year they had they had an employee of theirs selling things on eBay. And then they had to make an appeal to the British public to help them identify what these things were, because they didn't know. And when other countries asked for them to return certain things, some of the really ridiculous arguments they give, other than, oh, well, we can't because, you know, that contravenes the Museums Act, is that they're not going to take care of it in that country. They're probably going to destroy it. I mean, you know, finders keepers, but really, I'm not going to give you back what I stole because you're not going to take good care of it. That's a really ridiculous argument. And let's add to that there are other things that you could do. So the Horniman Museum, they actually returned some of the Benin bronzes that they had, because a lot of people in the local area, and they're meant to be a community museum, were really appalled by the fact that, you know, they had been taken in that way. And the Nigerian government was so pleased with this respect, as in returning ownership, that they actually then allowed them to keep quite a few of them to put on display. Sometimes it's about ownership. So we're not going to empty all of the museums, but if we were going to borrow the Mona Lisa from the Louvre, for example, we would enter into an agreement with them. There might even be some sort of exchange of funds in order to rent it for a period of time. But to take something and say, well, I stole it fair and square, that's not really the way you treat a country that you respect.
And monetize it.
Yeah. Mm. I mean, absolutely, and yeah, they do monetize it.
Why do you think that this discussion hasn't been on the table from the moment that Labour got into government? Because I do know the now Foreign Secretary was very interested in this topic, and for a long time he'd said, look, once we're in government, this will be a priority. Why hasn't it been?
Look, I understand that we have a lot of challenges in the country at the moment. And so it appears to be one of those things that maybe with enough lobbying and enough talking, people would maybe willing to open up discussions. But at the moment, with the challenges that we have, I believe that it's the type of thing that they don't want to talk about because of the amount of criticism you'd receive the other way. For the past couple of days, we've been hearing about it on the news, and we've heard the really negative reaction that some people have had. And the first thing that people say is, well, we've got a budget coming up. If we pay trillions of pounds in reparations, we're not going to have money to pay towards the budget. What about people in your constituency? And I said, hold on a second. We haven't even had a conversation. How about talking about it? How about finding out the different things that we could do to begin this process of, let's say, atonement that isn't necessarily going to touch our budget now, and have a conversation about it. But also, there's something that the Prime Minister of Barbados has been saying recently, and that makes perfect sense to me. We didn't finish paying off the compensation that the British government took out to pay the slave owners to end slavery until 2015. That means I paid it, you paid it, the Windrush generation paid it. How does it make sense that I paid the slave owners to release my enslaved ancestors? Because I've been working since I was 16 years old. That's the tax. That's the tax that I was paying, and many, many others. So she has been saying, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, that if reparations can be realised over generations in the UK for slave owners, why can't it be recognised over generations when you now realise that there's something to be owed to those that have been enslaved? And again, why do we not just start by looking at what we can do? countries like Barbados are being ravaged at the moment by the climate crisis. They're also some of the countries that are in the worst debt. And we have the ability to perhaps, assist with wiping those debts, so they actually, rather than spending a whole load of money, paying interest, can put more towards their climate resilience.
That's interesting. Would you advocate for a higher foreign aid budget in order to tackle the effects of climate change?
I would, but aid is not reparations. And I think it's very, very important to make that aid. I can be quite disparaging about aid, and I'll explain why. When I think about all of the millions and perhaps billions that have been paid in aid over a long period of time, it's quite upsetting, because you think that by now, with all of the so-called aid, things would have been resolved in countries in the global south. But the reason why they haven't is because aid has effectively become an industry. The overseas development has become an industry, so much so that you have private companies now working in overseas development for profit. And when you have an industry that works in the way that it does, let's be frank, it's every industry has supply and demand. All of those organisations benefit from keeping people at a certain level so they can continue to run their industry. They need to decolonise all of those NGOs, quite frankly, and every single one of them, if they claim to be doing what they're doing, should have as part of their mission statement to bring the organisation to an end.
I'm just going to do a bit of a topic switch. I wanted to ask you about Chris Carver, who was he was killed by an armed Met officer 2 years ago. In the wake of that, do you think that armed Met police officers need greater protections? Sorry, I'm going to do that question again, if that's okay. Sorry, just because of the... just the last bit. Do you think that armed police officers need greater protections?
At the moment, the Home Secretary has made clear that they're going to have anonymity now until they're charged. But since 1990, we've seen over 1,900 deaths in police custody or following contact with police. And I believe only 3 officers have ever been charged, and only 1 has ever been found guilty of manslaughter. So in terms of risk at the moment, there isn't a huge risk of this happening to them. I think it's absolutely right that if somebody dies following contact with the police, that it is investigated. I understand that they have a complex job to do, but in many other professions, if the same thing happened, that would be the case. I used to work in a nursery. If a child had died whilst they were in my care, of course there would be an investigation.
Do you think the verdict was correct?
We have to respect the process of the court, but also we have to respect the fact that the CPS thought there was enough evidence to put it forward for a murder charge. And I think because they have found not guilty, a lot of people are saying that it should never have gone to court in the first place. But you can't say respect the process if you don't respect how it got there in the first place.
I suppose the concern is the conversation has been that he was a very dangerous individual, and therefore it's been, I think it was even Robert Jenrick who said that we are now safer without him. I mean, that kind of rhetoric around someone, does that concern you about where our justice system is progressing to?
I think particularly in my community and in black communities across London, people are extremely upset about that rhetoric, because obviously the police didn't know who was in the car when this happened, so how would they have known that he was, I suppose, all of these things that are now being said. And the worry is that in terms of these incidences, in terms of harm or quite sadly even death, black men in particular are disproportionately affected. So there's a lot of concern about that. We need to understand that there is a lot of loss in trust and confidence between police and particularly black communities, and things have to be done to resolve that. And I suppose the idea that because somebody has done something bad, they could meet that end or should meet that end, I think that's what it is. People are saying they should meet that end, I think is really, really unfair.
It's almost an Americanization, I suppose, of our justice system. Yeah. Is that a concern?
That is a huge concern. This is not America. We don't just, first off, our officers aren't usually armed. That's in exceptional circumstances, and I think that's absolutely right. But we don't want to get to that system where all you would need is to think maybe someone was guilty.
Mm-hmm.
for you to be able to enact that type of action. That is the type of thing that would make people, particularly in the black community, scared. I mean, when we look at the Angelini review, we look at the Casey review, and we look at all of the discrimination, unfortunately, that we've seen within policing, that is the type of thing that strikes fear in the hearts of people who are most likely to come in contact with the justice system.